Hello, this is Darrell Castle with today's Castle Report. Today is Good Friday, the Friday before Easter. It is the 18th day of April in the year of our Lord 2025. I will be talking today on this Good Friday about the annual threat assessment of the U.S. intelligence community just issued and signed off on by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, who at this moment is Tulsi Gabbard. This report gives the assessment of threats the U.S. faces from each country in the world where a threat is perceived to exist, and is the combined assessment of the 17 intelligence agencies that are under the authority of the National Director. This report, which is published annually, is hot off the presses, but I don't recommend you read it unless you have a high tolerance for being terrified. Yes, once you've read this report, you will wonder how the people who deal with this stuff every day manage to sleep at night. I will take this opportunity to share the highlights of the threat assessment as determined by U.S. intelligence with you, so you don't have to read it and risk being terrorized yourself. The foreword to the report introduces us to what is about to be presented: terrorist and transnational criminal organizations. I suppose that means drug cartels and their national supporters. In other words, these drug cartels are supported by nations, directly threaten our citizens, and are directly responsible for more than 55,000 U.S. deaths from synthetic opioids in the last year, a 33% increase over the previous year. It's amazing to me just how destructive the scourge of drugs has been to America. Those who are addicted seem to have an uncontrollable desire for the drug which enslaves them. I suppose the drugs at first promise them a good time or relief from bad times, but they deliver instead misery and death. I certainly believe that the U.S. government should consider as threats the nations enabling the cartels who do it for money and for power. It's a difficult problem indeed, for the cartels, thanks mostly to China, apparently control virtually all of Mexico and have made significant inroads into the governments of the various border states, especially Arizona. Quote from the report: Western Hemisphere-based TCOs and terrorists involved in illicit drug production and trafficking bound for the United States endanger the health and safety of millions of Americans and contribute to regional instability, end quote. Well, that's a no-brainer, isn't it? So I wonder why no one in the government takes the time to explain to us, to Mr. and Ms. America, exactly what is happening and why such action against the cartels is necessary to save our lives. It is apparently just profit for India, but for China, they do it at cost because it's a weapon to weaken and destroy the United States. Mexico and its politicians are apparently so intimidated and terrified by the cartels and their multi-billion-dollar of assets that they always do the cartel's bidding. In case you had any doubts about whether or not international terrorist groups are still active and still intent on doing harm not only to the U.S. government but citizens as well, you can now remove any doubt. Quote, ISIS, most aggressive branches including ISIS Khorasan, or ISIS-K as it's called, and its entrepreneurial plotters will continue to seek to attack the West, including the United States, via online outreach and propaganda aimed at directing, enabling, or inspiring attacks, and could exploit vulnerable travel routes, end quote. Well, now, that's encouraging, isn't it? Our best intelligence assessment is that we know that ISIS seeks to exploit your travel routes. The report tells us that the New Year's Day attacker in New Orleans was influenced by ISIS propaganda, as well as the Afghan national who was arrested in October for planning an Election Day attack in the name of ISIS. The intent of the attacks was to demonstrate to us here in America and to the world that ISIS could attack inside the U.S. at any time. There are other international criminal groups outlined in this report, but for the time's sake, we move on to threats that involve entire nations. When the report speaks of China, it uses the abbreviation PRC for People's Republic of China. The PRC maneuvers constantly for ways to shape its power and influence in the world and for ways to gain advantage over the West, particularly the U.S. It uses its military to project power over Taiwan, as well as the various claims it asserts in the East and South China Seas. Have you ever wondered, when there are infrastructure problems here in the U.S., why so many things seem so dysfunctional? China might just be behind it, because cybercrime, cyber terrorism are two of China's greatest weapons, and this report makes it clear that all the potential damage is just sitting there, pre-positioned, waiting to be used in any conflict with the U.S. The bottom line for China, as outlined in this report, is this, quote, China presents the most comprehensive, robust military threat to U.S. national security, end quote. China's using complex whole-of-government campaigns, the report says, featuring coercive military, economic, and influence operations short of war to assert its positions and strength against others, reserving their more destructive tools for full-scale conflict. So, China uses its influence buying, its bribery of U.S. officials, its fentanyl production, its cyber attacks, its spying inside the U.S., its theft of intellectual property, its theft of actual property, its ownership of vast amounts of U.S. farmland, and its control of the manufacture of life-saving medications. China uses all those things as a kind of soft power to gradually weaken the U.S. so that it's less and less capable over time. Quote, the PRC remains the most active, persistent cyber threat to U.S. government, private sector, and critical infrastructure networks. The PRC's campaign to pre-position access on critical infrastructure for attacks during crisis or conflict, tracked publicly as Volt Typhoon, demonstrates the growing breadth and depth of the PRC's capabilities to compromise U.S. infrastructure, end quote. Volt Tycoon, I assume, is the code name attached to their infrastructure attacks. The report goes on to say that recent telecommunications compromises are PRC attacks. I could go on all day. More and more threats from China, but there are others to talk about, other threats out there, folks. Russia views its ongoing war in Ukraine as a proxy conflict with the West, and because it is so views the conflict, it carries increased risk of unintended escalation. Quote, regardless of how and when the war in Ukraine ends, Russia's current geopolitical, economic, military, and domestic political trends underscore its resilience and enduring potential threat to U.S. power, presence, and global interest, end quote. So, despite enormous costs incurred in the war, Russia has proven to be very adaptable and resilient. That's pretty obvious, isn't it? That is, in part at least, because of the expanded backing of China, Iran, and North Korea. President Putin appears to be resolved and determined to pay a very high price to prevail. It seems to me then, this is just me talking, it seems to me then that U.S. actions have driven Russia into the hands of China with its surrogates, Iran and North Korea, as well as enabling Russia and Putin to become stronger rather than weaker. Even the sanctions have forced Russia to form and expand the BRICS economic alliance as a way of working around the sanctions. More and more nations are joining. Therefore, more and more nations want to help Russia avoid the sanctions. Russia has suffered substantial ground losses in the war without losing any strategic capability. In other words, this report says the campaign to weaken Russia has been a complete failure and completely counterproductive. The war has afforded Moscow a wealth of lessons regarding combat against Western weapons and intelligence in large-scale war. More than likely, that information experience will involve challenges in the future conflicts, including other adversaries with whom Moscow shares the information. So, just in my own words, what that all means is we've made the world a much more dangerous place and much more lethal because we've shown the world how to combat our best weapons. Once again, the U.S. actions have made its enemy stronger and will probably involve future unnecessary casualties, yes. The word that keeps coming to mind regarding U.S. policy is self-destructive, especially stupid, unless U.S. planners want make the world less safe. Finally, folks, for Russia, it has the largest, most diverse nuclear weapon stockpile that, along with its deployed ground, air, and sea-based delivery systems, could inflict catastrophic damage to the homeland. In other words, this report says that nuclear conflict with Russia would most likely mean planetary annihilation and should be avoided at almost all costs. Flirting with nuclear war shows a very dangerous mind indeed. It's hard for any rational person to see as anything but insane. Once again, I could go on all day with this report's assessment of Russia, but there are other threats. In my view, this is the most important paragraph coming up here, folks. Listen to this. This is the most important paragraph in this entire report, and it renders current U.S. policy a little difficult to understand. Quote, "We continue to assess Iran is not building a nuclear weapon and that Khomeini has not reauthorized the use of nuclear weapons programs suspended in 2003, though pressure has been built on him to do so," end quote. Did you get that, folks? Because when I read this, it really mystified me. U.S. intelligence, all 17 U.S. intelligence agencies under the authority of the director says, the best that we have says in writing that it assesses Iran is not building a nuclear weapon. In light of that statement, how can the U.S. threaten Iran with, quote, something really bad is going to happen, end quote? Why move strategic bombers with 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs within striking distance because, quote, Iran cannot be allowed to build nuclear weapons, end quote? If your own best intelligence assessment is that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon. In conclusion, my own thoughts apart from this assessment is that the U.S. is, in essence, demanding that Iran demilitarize. I don't see that happening, folks. Iran is a theocracy, but then so is Israel. Therein lies the rub. I see nothing good coming from the U.S. being involved in a religious war on the other side of the planet. The last thing the U.S. needs right now, the last thing the U.S. needs to lose is a nuclear aircraft carrier. Finally, folks, the assessment tells us that our struggles with Iran have made its allies, China, Russia, North Korea, harder to deal with. And collectively, they are much more powerful than any of them are alone. In other words, according to U.S. intelligence, as usual, U.S. involvement has made the situation much worse. At least that's the way I see it. Till next time, folks, this is Darrell Castle. Thanks for listening.